coming from another one of these days of endless Zoom meetings. So a minute or two to grab a coffee is often snatched between them. Hello to those of you who have just joined us. This is the next in the series of webinars on developing a natural capital plan for Eastern England. And we're going to be talking today about your feedback and your guidance on how we should set targets. As always, there's going to be questions in the Q&R channel, and you can upvote things you like in there. You can also mention things in the chat. We've left plenty of space at the end for conversation, discussion, and other kinds of things of that nature. So feel free to pitch in, and we will, try and get to everything actually. Right, the numbers seem to have plateaued a bit, so I'm going to crack on, I think. So, I will if I can make this thing work. Jolly good. So, quickly, I'm going to remind everyone where we are in this process. We've been going since October now, which feels like much longer. We've got a huge amount of information on your project, on the fantastic things you're doing across all of Eastern England. In November and December, we got a huge amount of information from you on the objectives and actions you'd like to see considered in this plan. And over the last couple of months, we've been thinking a lot about targets. Just to remind everybody, I sent out a questionnaire at the last webinar, which a lot of people filled in, which I'll talk about in a second. And this session is going to be talking about your guidance, basically, the feedback you've given us on how you'd like to address target setting. And this is actually, in many ways, an interesting webinar because the next one is going to be about the first release or the first iteration of the prioritization. So the next webinar will actually have something really tangible to show you, and there'll be a lot of discussion, I suspect, and we'll probably have to make an extra long webinar just to make sure we've got plenty of time. So, without much further ado, first off, thank you very much for your input. Like I mentioned, we put up a questionnaire online to get your views on targets, which is still online. It's still available. We've had responses from 26 organisations, which I'm pretty happy with. I think that's a pretty solid number. I think that's definitely quorum, especially because the results were really unanimous. As you'll see as we go through this, it was a clear steer, a clear direction we got from you. If you're listening and you haven't filled it in, please do so. It's very short. It's only 4 questions. We'll process and include the results if we can, but either way, we definitely like your feedback. So the first thing I'm going to do today is talk briefly about what targets are, and just remind you about this and kind of set the scene. So the targets are the quantified descriptions of the actions and the objectives. So essentially indicating the natural capital that you want from Eastern England. So this is about expressing these things, about defining these things, about making it really clear and really transparent. They are absolutely about expressing yourselves, and they're an adjustable thing. These aren't something that we kind of agree and are set in stone. These are actually very much a vehicle for communication. So we're going to create targets based on the guidance you've given us, but these are absolutely going to be something we'll tweak between each iteration, and they're kind of actually in many ways they're more of a vehicle for conversation and discussion, decision making there of anything else. This is also going to make a lot more sense, I think, when the first maps are produced. It's difficult, I think, to kind of imagine these things in your head in kind of an arbitrary, isolated way. But when you actually see it on paper, when you actually start to see zones highlighted and identified, that actually makes sense. And you can contextualize in the areas in which you work and the areas you know really well. Then I think that'll suddenly bring the whole thing to life. So don't worry too much if some of this doesn't seem entirely clear, or if you're not 100% certain what it means. At the moment, we're just trying to kind of get a base level of shared understanding, and then we'll go into a lot more detail when the maps are out. And just to kind of also highlight that the targets are about identifying what you wish to achieve in a useful way. Fundamentally, these are about translating into practice. These are about what will help this plan move from something theoretical to something that's actually helping guide and inform action on the ground. So we've got to make sure that the targets are set at a way that most supports action. So, the results from the questionnaire. This is quite exciting for me as a social scientist. I actually rarely get to do things like questionnaires, so it was rather fun. So the first question was, should all habitats be dealt with equally, or are there some habitats which are particularly important? Now, the response was extremely clear. Actually, there are some habitats which are particularly important. Now, this is really useful. This is really useful to know that actually, broadly speaking, there is a fairly clear consensus that we need to focus on some more than others, that some that need our attention or more support. And this translates into the spatial prioritization analysis underpins SCP in two different ways. So we can deal with important habitats, firstly, by favouring them where there are overlaps. And I'll talk more about what that means in a second, because I appreciate that's not the clearest sentence in the world. And the second way we can do this is by setting higher targets for more important habitats. So where there are things that are really critical, you can turn the numbers up and say, actually, we want to establish more of these than we would of other habitats. I'll talk about this at the end, but for the first iteration, we're probably going to keep all targets the same for all habitats. This is so that it's we can sort of present a kind of clear picture of what the prioritization identifies, and then we can have more involved conversations about where to move the numbers up and down. If we start kind of trying to second guess or predict where you would like these numbers, if you'd like them different for different habitats, then I think that's probably going to present a more confused picture. So actually, for the first version, we're going to keep them all the same and then use that as a basis of conversation. But I'll talk more about this at the end. Right, so that brings us back to the first way of dealing with more important habitats by through the overlaps. So this actually, to understand what I'm talking about here, we have to go back to the data that we're going to put into the spatial prioritization. So those of you who tuned into the last month's webinar might remember this. This is the map of all the potential areas for habitat creation in the whole of Eastern England for all the habitats. And what you might remember is there are quite a lot of areas where these habitats overlap. You can see in this map on the right here, there's a spot here that looks like a figure of 8. And you can see a little spot of orange in the middle, there's light green, there's a kind of turquoisey green, there's a middling green. And actually what this tells us is this is a really fantastic spot for nature. And actually there's quite a few choices in terms of which habitat you create there. You can pick, there's multiple options. Now this is where we can kind of prioritize important habitats. What we do is we put the habitats in an order of relative importance. And then when the analysis has to make a choice about what we put where, it'll prioritize them in order of importance. So it'll put the most important one there, or if that's not possible, it'll put the next more important one there, and so on and so on. Now, a thing that to remember here is it'll only ever put it where it makes sense ecologically. So this is based off natural England data, so it's not going to suggest something where it shouldn't go, so something that's inappropriate. It won't suggest putting something in an inappropriate place, but it will go, okay, well, if you've got a choice about what you do here, we really should focus on the more important ones first and the less important ones second. Which actually then brings me neatly to the second question that we asked you, which is, when we have a choice about which habitat to establish, how should we rank habitats? And this is the results. So very clearly, freshwater systems, so rivers and lakes, came out as the most important, then the fens, then grassland, then reed beds, and so on. And this I found very interesting, partly because woodland came so low in the listings. I find that really interesting, but also it's really clear. The wetlands, the water-related systems came out as really highly important. So that gives us a really clear steer for this dealing with this overlap issue, this choice about what to establish where. So, for example, just to illustrate it, if there was a spot of farmland upon which you could create both fenland and woodland, then the SCP will go, right, well, people have said fenland's more important, so we will choose fenland there rather than woodland. Now, it's important to note that you will still meet the targets reach. It'll still try and make sure that the numbers, the amount of these different habitats that are established, restored, and conserved are consistent, and the targets are always achieved. It just will give priority in terms of these choices to the more important habitats. So there's a few kind of principles to this. One of them I already mentioned, which is that we'll only ever suggest creating a habitat where it's ecologically appropriate. And the natural England data that we've got that underpins all of this gives us a pretty comfortable level of confidence in this. Now, obviously, there are always slight problems with things, but overall, and especially at this regional scale, I'm pretty happy with how accurate this is going to be. The other thing that's important to note is that we're not going to just take this as kind of gospel. We're going to use your guidance to make the right decisions, but we are also going to use our best judgment to interpret this. This is, after all, about combining sort of stakeholder input and ecological principles together. Whenever we make decisions, we will always come back to you and seek your feedback and check. But we are going to kind of interpret this very much in the spirit of what you're saying rather than necessarily the wording. And to give you a really specific example, I want to talk about purple moorgrass and rush pasture. So this came out as the lowest in the ranked habitats, which is interesting because it's also a very rare habitat. There's only 8, well, in this part of the world anyway, there's only 8 kilometres squared in eastern England. Now, I suspect that this probably ranked very low because it wasn't on many people's radars, not so much because they particularly hate poor purple moorgrass, but rather because it's not something they're really dealing with because it's so rare. Now, what this means is that despite it being ranked last, we might actually raise its ranking slightly due to its scarcity, partly because due to our rarities, if we choose it last after everything else, we might actually not be able to meet the targets because there might be so few opportunities for restoring, protecting, and establishing it that actually, if it's at the back of the queue, you won't get what you want, which is a certain amount of increase. So we'll use the kind of ecological evidence to interpret your guidance in a way that makes sense, both from the stakeholder perspective, but also from an ecological perspective. And again, anything we do like this will always be transparent. We'll always talk about it. There'll always be an opportunity for questioning, basically. So on that note, a really important question is what currently is there? So this is the first of a massive pile of outputs that our planning team, Julia and Cesar, have been putting together. And this is the total area of each of these different habitats in eastern England. So how much is there of these different things? And you can see down the bottom there, purple moorgrass and rush pasture is right at the bottom at 8 kilometres squared. Now, before anyone starts asking why lakes are so low, this is the total area of good or higher quality habitat. So where are the areas of habitat that are in good quality, and all you have to do is kind of, keep it alive and everything will be well. It's important to note, that's something I've noticed here that I find interesting, is deciduous woodland is right at the top there, massive amounts of it, and lowland fend is somewhere in the middle, which possibly kind of links up quite nicely with what people have suggested about deciduous woodland being less of a priority. They put it second to last in the rankings. Now the next question that kind of follows from this is what area of this habitat is currently protected? To what extent are these existing good quality habitats protected by some form of regulatory or statutory conservation? And this is a really important part of the picture. This is a kind of an aspect of what we look at when we're putting together this plan. And this I kind of find interesting because there's massive variation as you go down. So for example, coastal salt marsh is the third most abundant habitat, but is also very highly protected. Whilst the lowland meadows is pretty rare, but actually only 30% of it is protected. And I think this is a really important aspect to this larger picture. Building from this foundation then, the next question is what can be restored? So that's an indication of what already exists, what's currently protected, but where is there habitat that is of low quality or fragmented quality, where a bit of effort can actually bring it back to life and bring it back to something really fantastic. Now, I'm going to kind of highlight a few things here. I find numbers a little overwhelming when they come in big tables like this, but I suspect that quite a lot of you are much happier with large numbers than me. So I wanted to put it up in all its glory, but I'm going to highlight a few important ones for those of you who are more qualitatively inclined, like me. So lowland fens came up as, I think, the second most highly ranked habitat in terms of importance. And interestingly, there's almost a 2.5 times potential for restoration here. You could almost increase the total area of good quality fenland through restoration by 2.5 times, which is a massive potential. But actually, there's even more potential for things like lowland meadows and reed beds, where you've got 34 and 25 square kilometres, but then a massive potential increase through restoration. And then last but very much not least, you've got lakes, where there's actually a very small amount of it that's currently in a good quality, and a 1,742% potential increase through restoration, which kind of really draws this out as a really high priority for restoration activities, which kind of is also interesting because it further draws the link between water and natural capital in Eastern England. The next question, and these all link to the zones, of course, is what can be established. So those are the areas that, we've already looked at the areas that currently exist, the areas where you could restore degraded areas, but where could you take farmland that is currently, in production and restore that, or establish new areas of habitat on there? And this is kind of a really interesting one because this is actually the action that you identified as most important during the objectives and action stage. And again, I'm going to fill out some priorities here. So again, for lowland fens, you've got massive opportunity for establishment, potentially almost 400%, just shy of potential for establishment. Lowland calcareous grassland, if I pronounce that correctly, also came up as high potential. But the kind of real winners here are the lowland meadows and the reed beds. That's a massive, massive potential for establishing new habitats there, which I think is extremely interesting. And the bigger picture of all this is to start to identify, what you've got and what the opportunities are for actions across Eastern England. And this kind of information we'll share with you when we put out the first version of the plan to really help inform the discussions around it, as this gives you a really kind of solid basis for fact. So I think another thing that's really important to me here is that the guidance that you've been giving us throughout this process, both for the targets, but also everything we've had so far, and the questions and the objectives and the actions, really links to the data. So to pull out one simple example, you suggested that woodlands are less important to you and fenlands are more important to you. And this is really nicely supported by the data. Woodlands are very abundant, whereas with fenland, there is a massive potential for restoring and establishing it. So it's really reassuring that what you're telling us and what the data is telling us actually coincides, actually kind of agrees with each other in a really nice way. I mean, I guess in many ways, that's a testament to how well you know your area and how well you know what needs to be done. This also links back to the projects that you submitted and the action that's taking place across Eastern England. There's a wide range of existing projects focusing on fens, rivers and wetlands. There's a lot of community action on chalk grasslands and things like that. And again, this kind of helps triangulate this. The fact that this again links up to the data and this is all, there's no kind of jarring inconsistencies. Actually, all this stuff blends really nicely and agrees with each other, gives me kind of quite a lot of confidence that actually this is going in the right direction. One of the questions that came up at the last webinar, and it's kind of been a persistent one, is does this project have a water bias? Are we focusing on water largely just because this is funded by Water Resources East? And this, as a social scientist, has made me a little nervous, and I've done quite a lot of thinking about this. And then I actually remembered, so I did a review for WWF in 2019 of natural capital planning. This was a big project looking at a massive number of spatial initiatives across Eastern England and indeed across the UK. And one of the key findings that came out of this was that all the stakeholders in their interviews said that water was intrinsically linked to nature conservation in Eastern England. And this was before I'd even met Water Resources East. So this was a real surprise to me at the time. I think for the stakeholders I spoke to, this was very obvious to them. And actually, this really reassures me that the links between water and nature come up again and again and again. And I don't think this is because of the audience, or this is because of the Water Resources East as the kind of facilitator of this conversation. I think actually this same connection has been drawn up from so many different directions that I feel very happy that this is actually based in fact and not in bias. So moving on, the last question we asked you was how ambitious should the targets be? And this is a real taste one. This is about what you want, what would be more useful. And the answer was really pretty clear. The most people wanted targets to be set high. This means that a larger area of Eastern England would be identified as priority parishes. There would be more opportunities for engagement and action, but then the priorities would be slightly diluted. And this is absolutely about taste. This is about what people would find more useful. This is what people find more inspiring. So I'm very happy to set targets a bit higher and be more ambitious. I think I'm very rarely sad to be more ambitious, so that makes me very happy. So how are we going to do this? So for the first iteration, I think what we're going to do is set targets equally for all habitats. We've had quite a lot of discussions about this as a team. I was wondering if maybe we should use some of the rankings to set those targets slightly higher. But actually, CISO's guidance on this has been that when we produce the plan, there will be a lot of discussions about how we turn the dials. For fenlands, for example, which keeps coming out as important, how much higher should the targets for fenlands be than everything else? Actually, CISO's suggestion was it would be much easier to have these conversations if we're building from a kind of baseline of everything being the same. If we start trying to kind of predict how much higher you think targets should be for these different habitats, actually I think that would just make things confusing. So for the get-go, we're going to set consistent percentage targets across all habitats for conserve, restore, and establish. And then when we release it and you see the map, then we can get much more into conversations about this and adjust it. Oh yes, pardon me. This will give us the clearest possible foundation for discussion. Another thing to highlight here is there's going to be a lot of opportunities for discussion and feedback. We haven't set a date for the next webinar just yet because I'd like to make sure we can meet it comfortably and we have plenty of time to prepare for it. But I think it's going to have to be a longer one. We might book this out for 2 or maybe even 3 hours. So there's a real plenty of time for questions and examination and critique and all that kind of other stuff that you need for a really transparent process. And then of course there'll be a whole online system for providing whatever feedback you would like to give us. So I think that covers pretty much everything I want to talk about today. It's a fairly kind of a light webinar today in terms of content, mostly because we're busy ramping up with the first prioritization. Julia and CISO are doing a huge amount of technical work, getting all the data into the right format and lined up in the analysis, which apparently now is running, which is now bug-free, which is a very exciting moment. And yeah, the next webinar, the next stage in this will be reviewing the prioritization, which will be a really big and exciting step. So that covers pretty much everything I want to talk about. I think now it's time for questions and discussions.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you, Sam. And there's some really, really good questions in here. So don't worry about finishing the presentation a bit early. I think we've got some good discussion to be.
I thought we might.
Now, absolutely, which is great. And yeah, just a slight frown on my face because I'm just taking this in. So I get to see this at the same time as you all do in the audience as well. So it just takes me a moment to process all of this. So let's do a couple of questions, Sam, if you may, and just see where the discussion goes. I mean, there was the question around there was the question around, from John Hiskett, is it likely wetland habitats come out higher because this initiative is from WRE and we are mainly from that background? So I think you've kind of answered that, but I think that's just one thing to I know it's kind of at the back of your mind, it's kind of been niggling you throughout, kind of thing. Where's the pollination? Where's the air quality kind of thing, coming through? Are they, are we being loud enough about that? And Henry had a question from Henry, had a linked one around, the WWF report you did when you identified how important water was. What was the distinction between kind of saltwater, the sea, and kind of coastal habitats and freshwater?
Interesting. Yes, there was. So saltwater was kind of, the consensus was that the coastal stuff was a bit of a different discussion, especially because a lot of it was about a sort of managed retreat as sea level rises. So it's a very different situation. to the freshwater stuff. There's almost, in fact, no similarities between them in terms of how you manage it. The question about, is this about a bias? I kind of feel like actually rather Water Resources East has emerged because of the importance and the important links between water and nature, rather than the other way around. So I think actually the fact that your Water Resources East is getting so involved in this stuff is an indicator of the connections rather than an indication of the bias. And this is something I kind of thought about again, as I say, as a social scientist. Bias is kind of one of the things that makes me most nervous or keeps me up at night. But actually, this has been triangulated from so many different directions now. I think when we write this up with the report, we're going to have a whole section on this because it keeps coming up. The connections keep being raised as important from so many different directions that actually I'm not concerned about that anymore.
Okay, and I'm dotting about. Some people are putting things in the chat and some people are putting in the Q&A. If there's any chance we could just put the questions in the Q&A, I just need to make it a bit easier for me to flick. But I've just put another one that I guess linked into bias in the chat from Tim Darby. Why have you targeted farmland for new habitat creation in the presentation? There's massive areas of unproductive industrial wasteland which could be used without impacting on food production and benefit the urban environment and those residing areas. So again, Sam, any kind of unconscious bias just creeping in that this is about farmland restoration and land use change linked to farming? So that's a really good question, Tim. Thank you.
So this is a really good point. I think there are probably two sources for this. One is the data that we use, and there's very good data on farmland. And I would have to check with my team about the industrial wasteland data. The other is the extent of these areas over the whole of Eastern England. So if there are large areas of industrial wasteland that span all of Eastern England, then we will include it. If there are not, and they're more of a localized topic, then we probably wouldn't. Largely because we kind of have to draw a line somewhere and find something that is the most broadly applicable to the whole region. But that said, I can check in with my team. I think you're listening. Maybe they can message me and tell me if there's a correction I should make there. Say so, I'll put my phone on. Yes, but I suspect it's probably because of the extent of that type of land across Eastern England rather than a particular bias.
Okay, great. But I guess, and Tim very helpfully put that in the Q&A as well. In terms of kind of just making it again another really important point. The small pockets of regeneration of small industrial wasteland could be really beautiful and could be then you get local community engagement and everything and kind of restoring and delivering some really quite remarkable kind of thing. So I guess the point you've made, Sam, the point you've been at pains to do all of this. This is not going to come up with a map that we then hand over to somebody to say, right, off you pop. Please deliver that now. This is the map will be the start of a conversation, and this is a new process. This has never been done at this scale. This is the feedback we're getting from a really fantastic number of people, and we want to include all of you and everyone who's contributed in the conversation that will ensue. So
yeah. Well, and just to follow on from that, if Tim, when we do this, you look at the map and you're like, well, look, you've clearly missed out this massive opportunity. You send us an email about that. You send us a message and go, actually, there's 10 kilometers squared of really critical stuff in this area that you could build on. You could restore nature on. Fantastic. Tell it, and we'll include it, and we'll draw a shape around it, and we'll assess it. So we're definitely going to miss a few things like this, just for the nature of doing something at this scale. But there's tons and tons and tons of opportunities in there for taking on your guidance and incorporating it. So please do come up with this question later if we don't include it properly in the first iteration.
Let's do an easy one. It's come to the top of the voting. Which habitat of the habitat list includes chalk streams? From
that is rivers and freshwater systems. We grouped lakes and freshwater systems in the rankings because I felt they were pretty comparable and pretty closely linked. But yeah, so chalk streams are definitely in there and came out top. So yes, don't fear, they have not been forgotten.
Okay, fantastic. Question from Katie Thornborough, Councillor Katie Thornborough from Cambridge. Are you aware of areas where loss of biodiversity still continues, and should not stopping further biodiversity be the kind of the overarching priority for us all in this?
Absolutely, 100% agree. So we haven't mapped where there is loss because that's a very difficult thing to predict. The best you can really do is sort of track trends, and trends obviously don't always continue at this scale. You know, housing developments, for example, follow their own unique patterns. But what we have done is identified where there is a need for protecting. So you'll notice that the first question, the kind of first data there we pulled out, the first question we asked after how much of these things currently is there, was how much is currently protected. So one of the zones will be to protect, conserved, which is basically identifying these areas where there is really important habitat and putting some kind of legislative protection on top of it. And that is how you present the biodiversity loss. You know, you get these bits as now actually they're critical. So yes, that's basically the first question we ask.
So I think Katie picks us up as a statement, targets, first above and beyond has to be, stop the loss of biodiversity, then conserve habitat, restore and establish. Would you agree, Sam? And that kind of fits the stopping the loss is in the protection, but that's kind of a baseline kind of thing. That's the minimum action that we want to do. Everything comes from above that.
Yeah, and there'll be targets for increasing the amount of land of habitat that is conserved or protected. And that essentially speaks directly to that loss. The purpose of that is to halt the loss in the important places.
Yeah. And just whilst I just have Katie's kind of name in my sights on the Q&A. So again, Katie makes the statement, preferences should be based on data of existing and potential. So should change depending on the specific areas under consideration.
Sorry, I can't find that question, and I didn't hear it when you just said it. You ask that question.
So preferences should be based on the data around existing and potential. So should change depending on the specific areas under consideration. I can't quite read that properly either. Katie, I don't know if you wanted to just pose that again to us in the Q&A, please. Is that okay? And we'll come to that if that's okay. Let's come back to that one. Okay. I just cover off the last one in the Q&A, then we'll move back in the chat, sorry, then we'll move back into the Q&A. So a question from Mark Knockert at Camsacre. Should targets be set instead to link with the potential for improving existing habitats currently not in good condition, combined with the potential for restoration increase? As the first series of slides shown, thus you get higher target from the start, for example, lowland fens and reed beds. Yeah,
that's exactly how we do it. We set percentage targets for restoration, protecting, restoring, and establishing based on the potential that can be achieved. So I believe, I'll double check with CISO, but I'm pretty sure that's how we do it. You can do it as a function of what currently exists, but I think we're going to be doing it on you know what? Let me ask you so and double check that one. I thought I knew the answer, and now I think about it. I'd like to double check before I say something I shouldn't.
Yeah. Okay. So flipping back into the Q&A, and I'll go from the top in terms of kind of just to remind everybody you can vote on the question. So if you like a particular question, then please click the thumbs up, and it will come to the top of my screen, which is good. So a question from David Pullen in the Q&A now. Sam, is treating all of Eastern England as one entity valid? For example, in the highly productive arable areas such as the Lincolnshire Fens and Lowlands, when there are already a lot of fen and water-based habitats, I'm sure the public would rank woodlands as much more desirable than wetland development. So yeah, thoughts around that, Sam? How valid is such a diversity of landscape? So I guess, sorry to answer, I guess part of the excitement of this was the scale of it and the diversity of landscapes and the complexity. But Sam, how would you respond?
So I think it is. If we had really jarring results, then that might suggest to me that we need to kind of bud off and have different conversations in different places. A lot of what we look for in the responses that we had is variation. Is there a consensus or is there disagreement? And actually, we haven't had any particular indication of disagreements like that. I think the other thing to note is that this is about planning for at the regional level, so there will still be massive space for local plans. So if we put together, if there's a plan that's put together for Lincolnshire, that might be then where people go, well, look, it might not be such a regional target for the regional priority, sorry, for these woodlands, but actually for our context, it's really important. So for us, we're going to set at the local level a much higher target because we think that's really important at our scale. And I think that that's completely a valid thing to do. And I think that kind of twinning of local priorities but kind of regional benefits is how these different scales of plan should speak to each other.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. And just a supplementary question within that, nested in that question from me and Gord around public opinion is important, but of course it can be a double-edged sword. Evidence and science should be used to inform public opinion, and then hopefully the activity that derives from this. I guess this is a very evidence and science-based plan as well as opinions.
Yeah, and so this is kind of why I highlighted when people, I was very happy that the evidence and the feedback and guidance we received are consistent with each other. People have said that woodlands are not such a priority, but the evidence suggests there's loads of woodland, which does actually make sense. If there's a lot of it, it's less of a priority. Whereas the fenland, there's not a huge amount of it, and there's massive potential for restoration and establishment, and people have said woodlands are really important. So the fact that those kind of the science behind it and the stakeholder input is consistent reassures me. And that's kind of partly why we keep asking these questions and keep triangulating and keep seeking your feedback, is so that any kind of jarring mistakes or any inconsistencies get brought to the fore really quickly. We can address them.
Brilliant. Thank you. Question from Lindsay Hargreaves, who is from the NFU and also sits on WRE's board. At what point does this process consider economic cost and what the budget should be and who pays? So how do we avoid producing a plan which is unaffordable and leaves a lot of people feeling disappointed?
Yes, this is a really interesting question, and it's a funny one because of the kind of slightly unusual time we're in. So this plan is about what people would like to see over the coming years in Eastern England. So this is about coordinating action. This isn't going to be a plan that we present to DEFRA and go, jolly good, here's a budget, can you pay for all this action across Eastern England? Rather, this is going to be something that is delivered by many, many different projects at many different scales, undertaken by many different stakeholders working together in different forms of collaborations across the region. This is going to be a combination of certainly ELM's money, ELM, I think is going to be a key part in this at some point, but then also county councils taking action, community groups, NGOs, water companies, private sector. I think this is going to be about everybody pushing in the same direction. And in order for everyone to push in the same direction, we have to have a shared vision. We have to have a kind of communal understanding of what is it we want in Eastern England and where should we take this? How should we improve nature across the whole region? So obviously this is a big undertaking, and nothing is guaranteed. We cannot kind of ensure that all these different people are going to work together, but the thing that we can do is really a really strong foundation, and that's what this plan provides. I think we are also in this unique position in that the way that money gets spent through what was previously the Common Agricultural Policy and now will be ELM or ELM is going to represent a massive shift in terms of the amounts of money that's available for these types of activities. And it very much remains to be seen how that's going to plan out. But I strongly suspect that if a really coherent plan is presented for what the people of Eastern England want, that is well evidenced and well resourced and transparent and democratically accountable, then that actually will provide a very compelling case that this should be the sort of thing that's used to guide, to some degree at least, ELM money. And so I think that the answer to this is through kind of a concerted joint effort and bringing as many different pieces together as possible.
And I guess also things like biodiversity net gain and offsetting from developments, another route here for kind of defining habitat banks and that sort of thing, where or potential kind of habitat bank candidates.
Exactly. Well, and the other thing completely slipped my mind, which is critical, which is that fundamental to SCP is it optimizes everything against economic cost. So the outcome this presents won't just be where's the best place for these things to happen. It's where's the most cost-effective and best place for these things to happen. So automatically baked into this cake is going to be this is the most economically efficient way of achieving these goals. So it considers that at its core.
And from a a WRE kind of strategic level, this is helping to inform our environmental destination. That's something that we are working with the Environment Agency to define the environmental destination for this region. What we then need to turn is translate that environmental destination into an environmental ambition. So how fast do we want to get to that destination? How much do we want to pay? What are the trade-offs we want to make along the way? And just thinking in terms of WRE, the year of two halves, the first half of this year is understanding things like our environmental destination. The second half, we will take you all of our stakeholders through that process of understanding trade-offs and options and things like that. So kind of stick with us. So this is one element of kind of the WRE big picture, but a really, really important one. Which is fantastic. Question from Peter Lansoff, and again, you may well have answered some of this, but how will you address maintaining food production and farmer incomes?
So this is a really important question, and this is kind of actually the core of this, because I feel like in many ways the main financial beneficiaries of the outcomes of this plan will be farmers. It's after all going to be them that are paid through offsets or through ELM or through whatever means to restore and establish and conserve habitats on their land. So I see this as a key way of providing alternative income streams for farmers. Partly because this is kind of the way things are going. There's a big shift in this direction, but also because there's a lot of appetite for private sector investment in natural capital nature, and that money is going to go in the hands of farmers. So I see this plan as a way of bringing together everyone's discussions about it and inputs to provide a really clear evidence base for where farmers ultimately should be paid for these things if they are willing. It's not going to force anyone to do anything they don't want to do, but I think it will present the opportunity. So that this map will present financial opportunities for farmers, I strongly hope. In terms of food production, this is a really interesting question, and I think it's not something we're going to be able to deal with at this level. I think rather what we're going to have to do is put together the plan for how natural capital and what can be restored and managed in the future. But it is considered in terms of the cost. So our cost layer takes into consideration the different grades of agricultural potential in terms of the land, and because those therefore have a higher cost associated with them, it seeks to avoid the areas which are particularly important for food production. So that is kind of baked into the basis of this to try and avoid conflict in terms of those aspects.
Brilliant. Okay, a few more questions to keep going through. So question from John Pennell. So to what extent does the increase in one habitat take from another?
That is it depends on the habitat. It depends on the context. So in no way will increasing one habitat doesn't reduce another habitat. It might influence where another habitat could potentially be created. So you'll never kind of be chopping down woodland and getting peatland there, but you might take an area of farmland and suggest, actually, even though we could have either woodland or peatland here, we think this should be peatland rather than woodland. So it only interacts in terms of the potential, and it won't. We will ensure that it won't prevent targets being met. So it won't be that actually, if you have more peatland, you can never have the full amount of woodland you like. Rather, we'll set it at the levels where you can achieve both. It's just more about the fine details of what you do where. This is as much about the analysis as anything else.
Great, thank you. Just to finish up, another question from John. Who defines important habitats, and are they in the eyes of the beholder? So how do you take away the element of kind of subjectivity from this?
This is super easy. This is all the inputs we had on the objectives and the actions. We had over 900 submissions from stakeholders in Eastern England, and they collectively have decided which are important. This is very much decided by the stakeholders, and I have to say we're still getting inputs on that, and we're still getting inputs from a wide range of people and discussions about the form of their inputs. So that is very much still a live question that we will revisit when the first iteration of the plan comes out.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam. Comment and question from Tim about Water Resources Southeast to put a lot of effort into mapping soil health. Are we doing anything along those lines as part of this work?
So I think I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure this is included in one of the data layers we look at in terms of establish and restore. There's been a focus on natural capital with this, and soil health obviously kind of bridges the two in terms of production and natural capital. So it is considered. We have looked at soil carbon storage. Currently, we're actually having a bit of a debate about how to deal with the productive aspects of this plan. So in terms of the managed farmland zone, and I know soil health is a key component of that. So I think come back with this question in the next webinar, and we'll probably have something more concrete for you then.
Yeah, certainly one of the data we've been looking at is the kind of land use classification under a range of climate change scenarios. You know, exactly how much grade 1 agricultural land will be left in the, under various climate change scenarios, etc. So yeah, soil is absolutely crucial. So yeah, thank you, Sam. Question from Brendan Joyce, Chief Executive of the Essex and Suffolk Rivers Trust. How does this work relate to the habitat action plans developed by Natural England and others a few years ago? Have we moved on from them, or are they still relevant?
So wherever we've found plans or existing materials, we've included them in the objectives and actions. Often what people have done is sent us, so for example, Norfolk and Suffolk County Council sent us the Natural Capital Evidence Compendium that they compiled, which included a list of priorities, so we included that. If people haven't sent us plans, we haven't included them. So it's been very much the relevance of plans and things has been determined, I guess, democratically is the way I'd suggest. If a single person suggests they're important, then we included them, and if they didn't, then we didn't. That said, I did do a massive review for WWF of all spatial initiatives, including in Eastern England, and I did go through that and make sure that we didn't miss anything critical. So specifically those plans, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but they would, if they would have been suggested, it would have been probably either by you or by people in that area, either county council or maybe the water companies, and that will be detailed in the big database of all the submissions we've got on the website.
Brilliant, thank you. A useful point of clarification from Henry Head around, around the saltwater, freshwater piece, which is very helpful. Question from Andrea Kelly from the Broads Authority. Could you share the method used for coming up with the establishment habitats, please?
Yes, this is actually a specific topic of interest for Julia. She makes her very frustrated when people publish things and they don't publish their methods. So we will absolutely be publishing the methods with the first iteration of the plan. When that comes out, there'll be a kind of an accessible pack, which just kind of outlines the key messages and the key tools and kind of helps anyone get to grips with it. But at some point, either with that or further on down the line, there will be a detailed write-up of all the methods, because we know that a lot of you have really strong technical knowledge.
Kind of a shorter video, just a kind of a summary video, just with a few kind of talking heads around this, and when will be a good time to do this within this process. Obviously, we could say, well, let's go back and watch the 1 hour, series of 1 hour webinars, but not all of us have got a morning to kind of devote for that. So a short video on this, Sam?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. So I think that this is probably something we deal with when we start getting feedback on the plans. I think one of the challenges is that this is so novel. There are so many ways that this is different to what's been done before. Despite SCP being an internationally used approach, this is a very new and exciting project. So it's difficult to kind of draw, and there's lots of comparables from different individual components of different projects, but not put together like this. So I think what we'll probably have to do is put together a kind of brief summary when we launch the first iteration of the plan, or possibly the second, because I appreciate that a lot of people, this may well be their first interaction with it. So some really clear explanations will be key.
Perfect. Question from Gary Santon. Nice easy one for me. Given the many of the challenges are linked with water, will WRE be liaising with the water companies to ensure their 25-year water resource management plans reflect this group's aspirations? Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are water company colleagues on this call this afternoon, which is fantastic. But the water company water resource management plans, which will be published in August 2022, which is the time when the draft water resources East regional plan will be produced, and the WRMPs, water resource management plans, have got to be absolutely back to back with the regional plan. One of the tests before the Secretary of State allows water companies to publish their WRMPs will be that it directly aligns with the water resources regional plan. So yeah, there will be absolute direct alignment between WRE's overall strategy for the region and then individual WRMPs from water companies. Here's a good question from John Pennell. Surely farmland is a habitat, Sam?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So I guess I would suggest that farmland is a land use which has habitats within it. There are species that thrive on farmland, but I think it's not what we think of as a sort of, when we think of more traditional habitats in terms of nature. So I think it wouldn't be appropriate to deal with it in the way that we deal with habitats in this plan. Rather, I think farmland should be dealt with through the manage zone, which we'll be talking about at the next webinar, and by avoiding the important areas of farmland, which we do through the cost-effective aspect of this analysis.
Yeah, perfect. Just sticking with farmland, just got a few more minutes left before we kind of wrap this up. So yeah, just again, coming from Tim, of course, this should not be all about farmers and their incomes, because a lot of farmland is actually controlled by landowning institutions who are not concerned about the farmer's income so much as the returns they can achieve through rental income. Yeah, this is not all about farmers or farmland or whatever. This is about the region's environmental destination, which we also have to then understand alongside at the same time the region's economic ambition. So these are the kind of the future demands for water, and then the options that we come up with will be a whole mix of options, some of which will involve farmland, some of which won't at all. So yeah, you're right. It's a good point, Tim, and keep making the points like that to us, most definitely. Okay, Mark. Yeah, Chris, a couple of questions from Mark Knockert from Cambridge Acre. Can targets to be set for habitats be aligned with their potential for a range of public services they can also serve beyond wildlife benefits, such as carbon sequestration, water quality, and of course public access and amenity value?
Absolutely. So this is actually baked into the analysis. So because we things like carbon sequestration and water quality were highlighted as important things that you want to deliver in your objectives, these are actually already included in it. So when we plan for where these habitats go, it's already considering carbon sequestration and water quality. And actually water quality is kind of one of the fundamental drivers behind where you establish habitat, because that's one of the key actions you can take to improve water quality. So that stuff's already kind of woven through it in terms of in many ways, these nature-based solutions are ways of achieving those particular benefits. But in addition, we can set targets higher for those aspects which provide those benefits. And that's absolutely something that we will be bringing up when we start to go into the kind of the detail of how much should we set these different targets for these different habitats.
Brilliant, thank you. Question from Andrea at the Broads Authority. So will you be gathering costs and success certainty for habitat restoration and establishment to feed into the optimized economic cost piece?
Yes, this is an easy question for me. CISO very recently so we've been using a bunch of different data from this. We originally began by speaking to some consultants and getting quotes for habitat restoration. But since then, CISO has managed to find a fantastically detailed bit of data that gives average costs for restoring and establishing habitat across the whole of the UK for different types of habitats in different areas. So she's currently very happy because she can actually properly represent these things. It's important to remember that it's always going to be about relative costs. You're never going to sort of turn around and go, right, cool, that's the bill for this action in this place. It's about, yeah, is this place better than that place? So, but yes, basically, we've got pretty good data on that, and that'll be released in detail when we talk about our methods.
Okay, this next question goes in the brilliant point category box for me from Andrew Alston. Just the response around, Andrew's farm is surrounded by protected sites, but the species in the protected sites feed on the farm and nests live in protected areas. So there's this symbiotic relationship. It's not this is farmland, this is a protected place outside. So nature moves, Sam, so how do we take it? Birds fly around, mammals wander, stuff wanders between protectors, and it doesn't know these boundaries. So how do we take that into account?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, and that's what I was kind of, apologies I didn't get that in my response to Tim. That was kind of what I was trying to express. Part of it is the challenge of how you respect that and consider it at different scales. So the local scale, you can really consider that nuance really well. At the regional scale, that's much harder because in some areas they're going to be farm like yours, and in other areas they're going to be farms where there's very little nature and it's actually mostly a monoculture. Part of how we're kind of dealing with this is what we will be identifying as priority parishes. So that's the kind of minimum pixel of this plan. And part of the purposes of that is that we know that working at the regional scale, we cannot really effectively consider farms like yours. We know that that's not going to be something that's appropriate to do at this scale. Working at the county scale or smaller than that, absolutely. Then you can really get into these nuances, and that's totally the right place to deal with that. But at this scale, we're dealing with it in kind of broader brushstrokes. And just to kind of draw it back, that's partly why we've set the minimum pixels at the parish level. It's because we respect that we cannot, we don't want to pretend that we have a higher level of kind of clarity, accuracy, or specificity than we actually do.
And Andrew, just one of the things we're talking to Sam around now is obviously how this is the regional work. But again, for example, our Norfolk water management plan, how does SCP align with the water fund process and the work that we're doing in Norfolk is going to be is an interesting kind of live discussion that we're having with Sam and the Nature Conservancy, and that will be a good moment to kind of just dive down to a different scale. As we work in Norfolk. So last question, and then we'll just next steps and wrap up, Sam. So from Mark Knockert, should targets be set instead to link with the potential for improving existing habitats currently not in good condition, combined with potential for restoration increase? So you get a higher target from start lowland fens and reed beds.
Yes. So yes, basically, it'll be linked to. Hang on. So the targets will be set in relation to what currently exists. But your point is that actually it could be set to the potential rather than what currently exists. And that you're completely correct, but basically that's something we'll have to come back to you for consultation on, because that's partly a value judgment. So if you think that, for example, there's massive potential for increasing woodland, but actually you said woodland probably isn't that important to you because there's already a lot of it. Whereas if there's in some particular habitats like the fens, actually you really want to realize that potential. That potential is a really meaningful thing to you, in which case we should base it less on what currently exists and more on what could exist. But that's a decision that you have to make. That's not one that we can make. So what we're going to do is provide the space for you to tell us that. So we'll produce a plan first off that sets equal targets based on what currently exists. And then when you and other people who think like you go, actually, no, this particular habitat, you need to look at the potential. Fantastic, great. Then we will adjust the targets in the way that you guide us to for those that you think are particularly important. So it's very much about, we'll start with this baseline, and then you will help us kind of interpret that so that it actually reflects what you want.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam. And yeah, just some sensible words from John. Yeah, farmland may be viewed as a poor habitat, but to ignore so much of our land area would be missing a trick or two. So yeah, we're not going to be doing farmland.
No, my apologies. I don't mean to malign farmland.
No,
I was more talking about the way that the analysis functions. It's not ignoring the potential and the importance that farmland has for England's nature. It's more about the way in which they are managed. People aren't making an income from habitats, so it's dealt with in a different way in the analysis, or at least not in the same way they are a farmland.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sam. Thanks again for an amazing set of questions and a really fantastic level of engagement. You know, we kind of present these kind of hour-long, or Sam presents these hour-long pieces of information in terms of kind of where the project's got to. We've got several months left to go. We all want to see these maps and everything. Appreciate for some of you this may be the first one of these webinars we've joined. Some of you this may be you've been to all of them. So if any of this isn't clear, if any of this is controversial or isn't sitting well with your organization, then please feel free to drop me or a member of the team a line, and we'll very happy to pick up a conversation individually with you, as we are doing with a number of groups. So we got this. Don't go off this webinar thinking, crikey, that's all a bit odd, I wish I knew more, or whatever. Or I've got a couple of burning questions I need to ask Sam, but I don't want to put them in the Q&A. That's what we in the WRE here team to do with Sam's help.
Completely. Well, and my phone number is rather boldly put on the bottom of everything. So if you feel I've maligned farmland, just give me a ring and we can talk about it, and I can correct my ways if I need to. Very happy to do that. Well, and the next one is going to be a really exciting one because we'll actually have a map to show you. So I'm very much looking forward to that. We will have a date set. Basically, we will set a date when I'm very confident that we can get everything done so that we can give it to you in the best possible form. That'll probably be the end of March or early April, depending, basically. And we'll give you plenty of notice, and there will be a little pack. And like I said, this will be a much longer one. So that's a really important one to put in your diaries when it does get announced, because that's going to be a doozy.
Brilliant. Sam, thank you very much indeed to you and the team for your continued work. Thank you for answering a lot of questions live this afternoon. Thank you enormously to everybody who's taken an hour with us this afternoon to join in. Really, really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your input. Really appreciate the fact that we're heading up for nearly 1,000 different objectives that have come in already. So
yeah,
just wonderful. So, and if you're still back at that, in entering objectives, then I'm sure Sam would be delighted to have any more. And again, I spoke to people this morning who have kind of come to this now and wish to enter the process and wish to hand in some objectives. It's never too late, is it, Sam? It's not too.
Absolutely. Well, and I also feel like it's a real testament to the quality of your questions that we're starting to get to the point where I'm going to have to check with CISO. I think that's some of the first times where the questions start to get technical enough that I'm actually starting to get a little out of my depth, which I think is a really fantastic indication of the level of engagement that we're getting.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much, Sam. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Cheers. Bye for now.
Thanks, Nancy. Well done, Nancy. Thank you.